Welcome to Founders and Funders and this session on Purposeful Innovation. We are extremely excited because it's the first time we're collaborating we have a collaboration between Founders and Funders and the SPS events team. We're grateful to all our partners that made this possible: Enterprising Oxford, the Entrepreneurship Center, and especially the SPS events team at Tiffany, Lexi, Maria, Leah. Thank you so much for making this happen. So for those of you who are new, welcome. For those who have joined some of the Founders and Funders events before, welcome back. My name is Kristoffer Gandrup-Marino, and together with Professor Thomas Hellman, we'll be your hosts and moderators for today. So this year is special. The Side Business School is celebrating its 25th anniversary. And to celebrate this milestone, rather than looking back, we want to focus on the future of business. This happens under the banner of Business the Next 25 Years. We explore many of the challenges that society will face in over the next quarter century and the role that business will play. And this Founders and Funders event will contribute to this discussion. So what is Founders and Funders? It's a digital community and event series that bridges the gap between science and business. And it was born out of pandemic times. And by popular demand, we're still around. So we are joined today by a fantastic panel to discuss the topic of purposeful innovation. So we have amazing speakers. To start with, we have Professor or Dr. Bram Govaerts, who is the Director General of CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, calling in from Mexico City in Mexico. We have Kristoffer Gandrup-Marino, who is the Chief of Innovation at UNICEF, based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And we have Dr. Louisa Ludbrook, one of our own, who's currently doing the Executive MBA, but also the Vice President Global Sales at Oxford Nanopore Technologies, joining us from Oxford. So today's topic, purposeful innovation. How are innovative ideas turned into scalable global solutions? So our speakers will speak about their own field and their own perspective regarding these innovative solutions. One will speak about food security, the other one about humanitarian problems, scientific challenges, and then how does this actually accelerate empowerment, democratization, and equitability in these extraordinary times? So before I'll give the word to our panel, and we're going to start with Louisa and then go to Bram and Kristoffer. I would like to make you aware, just some housekeeping. This session is recorded. You are going to end up on TikTok, YouTube, and any of these other social medias. So just that you're aware. Please do use the chat to post any questions. Mention your name and where you're dialing in from. And so we will have now 40 minutes of conversations, and then afterwards we'll move to the Q&A, where you have the possibility to ask all the hard questions that we didn't ask our panel. So Louisa, could you briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Kristoffer and then Bram.
Thank you, Christian, and hi to everyone joining online. I'm not sure I'm ready for TikTok, but here I am. So I'm Louisa Ludbrook. I'm Vice President Global Sales at Oxford Nanopore Technologies, which is a UK-based public company with an international reach in the field of genomics. We're currently focused on DNA and RNA sequencing. Our goal is to enable the analysis of any living thing by anyone, anywhere, which demands that we work towards democratization of genomic sequencing globally. And what does this mean for our products? It's generating data in real time, providing extra information from a biological perspective, enabling portability or ease of use, and of course, economic pricing to enable better access. That's my intro.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Louisa, and thanks for joining. Over to you, Kristoffer.
Thank you so much, and equally delighted to be here. It's a wonderful setting, a wonderful group. So I kind of have two hats. So I'm here in my capacity as Chief of Innovation at UNICEF, but I also have another life, so to speak, as board member, chair of a series of impact venture capital funds. So the role at UNICEF is being responsible globally for what we call product innovation, which is about driving R&D and scale of new innovative products. So this is basically about identifying areas where current products procured throughout the globe do not appropriately meet the programmatic needs in the field. UNICEF procures for $8 billion worth of products and services a year. And of course, there's a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room for new products in that portfolio product. So our role is then to identify these unmet needs, communicate those out to industry, drive industry, innovators, academia, and NGOs to develop products and subsequently scale them. And importantly, we always work on behalf of government mandates in the countries we work in. So everything we do is done hand in hand with them. Thank you so much.
Bram, over to you.
Thanks, Christian. And first and foremost, I want to thank founders and funders for this opportunity, but also the Side Business School. But happy birthday, 25th. That's no longer a teenager. Things are getting serious now. So my name is Bram Govaerts. I'm originally from Belgium. I have the honor of being the Director General of CIMMYT. CIMMYT is the International Mason Wheat Improvement Center. It is based in Mexico, but it has offices in 17 countries, and we're active in more than 50 countries. You may not know CIMMYT or haven't heard about the name, but you have for sure been impacted by what we do. Because if you have eaten bread and maybe consumed some maize products, very likely you consumed the result of our innovations. 70% of the wheat grown globally is provided through the network of CIMMYT and its collaborators and its innovations, and 50% of the maize varieties. We safeguard for humanity 140,000 wheat types or wheat accessions and 28,000 different maize accessions. And we innovate together with farmers, together with NGOs, together with technicians, with local scientists to come to better solutions for food security. I am also a board member of Grupo Ceres, a series of companies in Mexico, which keeps me sharp on the private sector side. And I'm very, very honored that I'm AD Professor at large for Cornell University. But even more important, I'm an alumni of the SPS. Thanks. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks for that introduction, everyone. So the question that we are addressing today is how are these innovative ideas that we find around us turn into scalable global solutions? And I would like to ask Thomas to ask the first question. Over to you, Thomas.
Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. So very briefly, I'm Professor of Entrepreneurship and I'm leading the Creative Destruction Lab at Oxford, and I'm very excited to be here. I'd love to talk with the panel about really the title, Purposeful Innovation, and I think there's a number of things that come to mind, but to give it a sort of concrete direction, there's a tension in the innovation world between sort of a technology push vision where we're really building new technologies that we then think will create the social purpose. And there are others who are very much driven by the social issue and then sort of backwards try to find the technologies. How do you handle that tension between technology push and market need? And I think anybody can start, but if I have to pick somebody, I will go with Bram.
Thanks, and I think this is a brilliant question, and I think CIMMYT has learned it through history actually to grapple with it, and we call it moving from a push to a pull, and it actually shown very, very clearly with a system that we have here in Mexico, where we work with 300,000 farmers, and we combined research platforms with on-farm learning by farmers together with technicians, and then farmers applying everything apply those innovations and sourcing data back. So we set up a system where you combine very controlled scientific activity that has its own rules and data systems with more crowdsourced, messy data, but a lot of data involved, and how can you bring those two together? But more importantly, I think we understood that it is very necessary to make innovation safe, especially if you work with smallholder farmers that are already with very, very small margins, but at the same time very used to risk taking and risk management because it's inherently there. And one of the examples was we would be pushing new innovations, a better variety, a better way of growing a crop, until we realized if we keep pushing, we're never going to get to scale. So probably what is required, we went to the market and said, can we actually create an opportunity for companies to buy grain from smallholder farmers with a certain value proposition. So today we work with companies that want to communicate to their customers that they're actually making a difference by buying grain and turning it into a food product, and by buying it from smallholder farmers that are innovating. But in order to do that, we needed to set up the data system so they actually can communicate that to their customers. So actually, to answer your question, we strongly believe that there's a place for both. You can somehow push, but then you need to create that pull, and those two need to work together in a systemic setup that makes innovation safe from a traditional culture to modern research and innovation.
Fantastic. Maybe I'd love to go to Louisa next, because I mean you're working for a very technology-driven company, came out of Oxford, amazing science behind it. How do you handle this tension?
Yeah, I think there is a tension, but it's also a process. And similar to what Bram had said, technological innovation and the downstream impact of that take time. I know our CEO says, we're an overnight sensation, 17 years in the making, right? So none of us are looking to solve simple problems in the present when we're thinking about the way that technology development can transform many different areas of our day-to-day world and how we live in it. So I think that addressing only an explicit problem or a well-articulated demand in a current market does miss opportunities for that broader systems impact. So I think there are advantages for innovating. And, how do we do that? Well, when we're thinking about design, we're thinking, of course, about our core purpose, enabling anything to be sequenced by anyone, anywhere. How do we think about that purpose? It really is about scalability, and that's about accessibility. We do our best at the early stage of thinking about the product, so the technology itself, which looks a little bit like this with a USB plug, all the way through to the commercial model. We think about ensuring those benefits are baked in. And so that can mean many things, baked in from a product performance perspective, from a service support perspective, from an economical perspective, what does it cost, the commercial model and pricing. So accessibility for us starts at that early stage, not just a tagline on a website, but it actually allows then for that uptake, we hope, from a broad range of individuals in many different situations and local environments. They're the ones who then get to pick up a product, understand what innovation is required at the local level to solve a problem or to generate an insight. And of course, they're in the best position to do that, not us. So we see ourselves as innovators from a product perspective, but actually capability generators, so that those at a local level can solve problems in their own hands and based upon their priorities.
Fantastic. That was really fascinating. I'm going to ask everybody in a moment to sort of think of very concrete examples of purposeful innovation. But certainly, first, love to hear from Kristoffer about sort of this bigger question: technology push, market pull.
I mean, what an amazing way to open up this panel. This is, for all of us working in innovation, maybe one of the biggest dilemmas we're constantly moving across. And as was excellently outlined by the other panelists, this is not a simple thing, and the truth is in the balance here, right? It's strike the balance between the desired and the possible, and going to any one extreme doesn't really solve it. For years, we were having a technology push approach. There was a bit of a tendency to everyone saying that, too many people are focusing on a gadget approach and shouldn't do that, and then they go on with a gadget approach where they think they've got a better understanding of it. So we've been pushing very, very hard to sort of drive towards a need-driven approach. And in the environment we work in, that's extremely complex to a large degree, because those who buy are not the ones who decide, who's not the same who use. So Path, a big NGO, developed this sentence that said, those who use, those who choose, and those who pay the dues, to illustrate this complexity. So to understand what those needs actually are is super complex. But in our effort towards moving more towards a need-driven approach, we realized, related to this complexity, how difficult it is to dig in and truly understand. And there's a lot of people throughout the development space who have the idea that you just got to go ask the beneficiaries what they want. And as per this illustration, that's not the case, right? So it's always difficult, and users in general can't tell you what they want. There's tons of books written about this stuff. So to an increasing degree, we are trying to dig in to this matter to understand so the full suite of activities around understanding a need, and then also now going a little bit counter, sort of based on the notion that, you know, few of us know what we want until we see what's possible. So we're trying to have a bit of a technology push approach in the sense that we are inviting within certain opportunity spaces actors in to show us the kinds of products that could be possible in an area of technology or possibilities, innovations. And then based on that, we let ourselves be inspired to then go to the need-driven approach. So yeah, I think everyone who's worked on it, me for sure, with all my many venture capital deals, have always struggled with that aspect, and sort of, yeah, trying to strike that balance is not easy.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think those were really interesting and sophisticated questions. Now, maybe we can sort of make this conversation come alive with a few examples. So I'd love each of you to sort of pick an example from your business where being purposeful meant that you did things differently than a traditional purely commercial approach would have looked like. So I guess I'll just have to shuffle up the order a little bit, and Louisa, if I may, I'd love to start with you and then sort of continue with Kristoffer and then Bram.
Sure.
Now, I mean, Louisa, I'm sure you've got many examples. I know that Oxford Nanopore has been really quite a model company during the pandemic, but obviously there are many examples before and after it too. So over to you. Just give us a flavor of what it means to you to be a purposeful organization and to do things differently.
Absolutely. And, you know, the purpose is at the heart of the company, from our founders, from the first 100 employees to the next waves that have come through as we've grown. And that permeates through all aspects of what we do. We are a commercial company as well, so we're not operating in that non-profit space. So we have to find that balance of ensuring accessibility, ensuring we have the right breadth of customers to eventually realize our vision. So an example that I'd love to share, and you know, this project has slowed down during the pandemic, as have many, but it was a group called the Cassava Virus Action Project, a network of scientists and researchers led by Dr. Joseph Nurunguru and Dr. Laura Boykin. And their goal was to take genomic sequencing to the smallholder farmers in East Africa with the intent to on-site in real time, so within a 24-hour turnaround, to be able to extract materials from the cassava crops, prepare sequencing and run the analysis in order to be able to identify the presence of known pathogens, which were not visible just from looking at the crops. And of course, this information was hugely powerful to allow the farmers to take a quick action to manage or maximize the crop yield of their own fields. What would the normal status quo have been if they'd wanted to use sequencing to do this? It would be to send the samples off to a lab, potentially in another country, and wait for months for the result. So you start to see how the benefits that we've baked into the product can be used in novel ways with a local need. And that's not something we as a company would have been able to do. So I love that example. You're right regarding COVID. I think what has been really wonderful to see is the ability of local level public health labs, or actually just academic labs that had access to sequencing, to respond rapidly to that urgent need as the COVID pandemic hit different countries, and be able to sequence the COVID virus to support government authorities doing viral tracing and tracking. And I think we have over 85 different countries running nanopore sequencing for COVID surveillance now, and over a million genomes, COVID genomes submitted to the GISAID database as a result.
Now, these are hard examples to follow, but Kristoffer, may I go to you? What would be sort of a good example in your work?
So I think I'm going to pick one that's sort of hot off the press, which is this oxygen plant in a box, as we call it. So in the midst of the pandemic, once the world realized that oxygen was a pivotal part of the solution to address COVID, a lot of activities were happening around oxygen. And we saw a couple of procurement endeavors happening in countries where countries procured bespoke solutions, so they designed the solution from scratch and got an engineering company in to specify the needs, and they didn't go well, to say the very least. So then we pushed through from innovation to standardize a solution for this, much pushed back on by engineers who claimed that all situations are different and case by case and this and then the other. And we said, but it's entirely unrealistic that every country is going to design these from scratch. It's going to take a very long time to create them, and we'll see a lot of issues along the way. And in general, an oxygen plant is an oxygen plant, right? You might need a bit of a different size of it, but it's a standardized thing. And of course, you can standardize it and thereby improve the procurement process. So we took a project from zero to procurement worth of 40 million in a year and a half, which when you work within the UN is extremely fast. And sort of experienced the enormous momentum we got once we really pushed through and sort of said, okay, this is the way we're going to do it. And we know that there's pushback from a lot of those sort of working in the field on it, but we believe this is the right thing to do. And then many other actors followed after us. So a solution that is it's being implemented as we speak across a number of different countries, has been implemented in some and will be implemented in additional going ahead. That is creating a lot of value in its simplicity, you might argue, or at least reduction of complexity by standardizing this thing, but also an example of where you get pushback from those sitting deep in the weeds. And you have to realize that very often innovation is about reducing complexity, especially in these environments, right? So you can argue the innovation height, at least compared to what Louisa was talking about, is not very high, right? This is standardizing something that exists, and many have some version of a solution for this. We standardize it even more. But in the complexity reduction that this allowed for, we saw a lot of positive impact on the ground coming out of it.
I love the emphasis on simplicity and making complex things simple. That's such a powerful message. Now, Bram, I'm sure you've got your a fascinating example up your sleeve. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to innovate a little bit here and maybe give first an example based on a failure where we started with the big project. Is this project I mentioned with today 300,000 farmers? We just got started. We were a bunch of scientists, more looking at agronomists, soil scientists, saying we need to increase these farmers' yields so that higher income when they and higher yields for maize and for their beans. And so what did we do? We worked on new seeds, better practices, etc. And so at the end of the season, when I had a discussion with the farmer and said, well, what did you think of what we did? He said, well, the thing you did is you brought us into trouble. That was for sure not what I thought he was going to respond, because we increased his yield with 200%. What he was talking about is that he didn't know what to do with all that grain. He didn't have post-harvest solutions to actually safeguard that grain, and 2% of it was back lost, frustratingly, by post-harvest losses. So it sounds very logical. If I tell it now, it's a bit shameful. We didn't think about it. Now, luckily, we had a hard negotiation with our donor. We are a project-driven organization. And I did put in one line item that says, and anything else that needs to be done to be successful. So luckily, thanks to that innovation in project management, we could actually set up then a post-harvest effort for farmers to work on small post-harvest technologies. But I think that shows also a mindset shift that that I've never forgotten, that is to look at problems from an outcome perspective and not necessarily from the process or technology perspective, but rather say, what's the outcome we want to achieve? And in the context, is there then an innovation that we can do, which may start from a traditional knowledge combined with some innovation. Now, another innovative example was when we had COVID for wheat, I call it, or UG99, which was a rust disease in Uganda in 99. And many of the varieties out there were actually not resistant to it. So there was a big threat to the world to actually lose all wheat production. And what we did was bring together a coalition of response of multiple actors very fastly, go back to our biodiversity, design or combine different seeds and generate a new seed purposely resistant to UG99 and move that out. But that also got us the question, how can we shift from constantly trying to be better at resolving yesterday's problem by resolving tomorrow's problem? That actually brings me to one of the technologies mentioned here, or innovation mentioned by another speaker, which is the genomic sequencing. So what we decided was, can we actually sequence, get the information from all our biodiversity that is in our gene bank, that is in our biodiversity bank. But more importantly, we're starting a new project where we're saying, could we actually look at where this seed is going to land in an environment? Because between seed creation, between breeding and getting the seed to a farmer, there's like 10 years. Now that means in those 10 years with climate change, the climate can actually have shifted in that place. So can we, this is a new question we have posed ourselves, can we look at the place with the data we have, with the crowdsourced data, what's going to be the future climate? What's that environment going to be in the future? And can we already today put in traits or alleles that are no regret investments, that when that seed reaches that place, it is actually somehow more resilient to the environment that will be there. Now, I don't know if we're going to make it, but this is one of the challenges, how we try to shift from resolving as fast as we can tomorrow yesterday's problem to actually be able to today resolve some of tomorrow's problems.
I love that phrasing. I'd love to go to Christian, who I'm sure has got lots of questions up his mind.
Yeah, thank you for these brilliant answers, and I would actually like to use the opportunity to explore just what Bram said actually a little bit further. So each of you has a very sort of concrete example of a innovative idea. Louisa even showed us the sequencing device. She held it up and she said, well, this is what we, exactly, there it is. This is what we built. And Bram mentioned the seeds, and Kristoffer mentioned the devices for air. So I can imagine this is then sort of thought out in one location and broadcasted and sent around the world and into different locations. And as Bram mentioned, well, this might have sort of different implications in different settings. So how do you translate the context into your work? And I can imagine that on one hand, maybe a device is something that is innovative, but I can also imagine that the way that you roll it out could be innovative. Could you maybe give us some examples, or one example of what it looks like in the local context? And especially since you're working with such large organizations, so many different contexts, what would that look like? And since we just heard from Bram, and I saw Louisa hold up the device, and I see Kristoffer smiling. Louisa, I would like to go to you first, because you talk about the democratization of sequencing, democratization of science. What does that look like locally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's not one size fits all. I don't have the solution for ensuring accessibility in every location, but we're doing our best to get common ground in terms of those baked in benefits as a starting point. I think one of the key things that we think about is the commercial model, right? As a for-profit company, ultimately we do need things to add up at the end of the day for sustainability from our perspective also. For true accessibility for a sequencing device, it needs to be cheap, right? And that's something that we've worked hard to do, and that's based upon the technology itself, but the model that we choose. And we've chosen a model that doesn't require a scientist to spend a lot of money on capital equipment. In fact, our commercial model enables people to get that device for free, and they pay for their consumables or their razor blades as they go. We think that's transformative, but that's not everything. And I think that we may get to this as a bigger discussion, because I'd love to understand what for-profits can learn from the non-profits in this perspective. But it's probably no surprise we can have a product with baked in benefits at a really low cost, which offers technological advantages. But if you can't ship it, and if you can't get through customs, and if you can't ensure transport of the goods in a state which allows them to be readily used from their box, then it's meaningless. And I think that logistics and scalability of logistics networks for technology that is low cost poses a real challenge. I'd go one step further to say that the current ecosystem, particularly around sequencing technology, and I'm sure we can broaden that to a lot of other technologies. I value input here, has been set up to support more centralized facilities, those that have funding and can afford the way that the goods are priced now. And as a result, the entire value chain for shipping and logistics, each person has their piece of value. When you then try to sell a low-cost product where there's very little to be made at each step along the way, that's quite hard to make work in a for-profit setting. So I'm really keen to hear thoughts on that. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have for accelerating accessibility in many different geographies. And that involves governments as well. We have, local import requirements, documentation requirements, all very important, but can add cost for an end user to access goods. Sorry if it's something that others want to comment on, but I'd be keen to hear too.
Yeah, and I think that would be actually a nice bridge to Kristoffer, who has an organization that goes to very remote areas and engages with people in all sorts of different ways. Could you enlighten us, Kristoffer?
Yes, I was back in my corporate days. I was at a conference once and met a guy from P&G, Procter & Gamble, and talked to him about their sort of marketing approach. And he said, it cost $1.4 million to build a brand, and he couldn't care less whether it was a deodorant or a shampoo or whatever it was. One of the things so the point of the story is that one of the things I push a lot for internally is that we stop treating these things like they're a one-off, like they're case by case. So nothing is, of course, entirely alike, nor is it entirely different. But many of the processes that we go through are alike, irrespective whether we are, in Africa or somewhere else. And often the challenges we encounter are much more dependent on the type of project we're dealing with and who we are selling to, more than, whether it's a wash or a health product or whatever it might be. So understanding the determinants for the approach you need to take in order to drive uptake is critical. And I do believe that, as with anything else, there's a profession in go-to-market, there's a profession in marketing, there's a profession in having a dialogue with government. And one of our big enemies is when people think everything is case by case and you can't abstract and generalize across some of these things. Of course you can. You just need to approach it at the right level, at the right abstraction. The point you're talking to, Louisa, of sort of bring down cost and ensuring access is, of course, absolutely essential to us. UNICEF fundamentally works out of the equity principle, which is to reach those furthest down, those who've got the least. And I think, many of us like to refer to, say, the mobile banking or something like that, where Africa was a pioneer. But in many other areas, and I would argue the standards, you see a sliding scale, right? So things take time to commoditize. And I think that the critical part in reaching access is to respect that, you shouldn't let perfect get in the way of good. So reaching those that are maybe a little bit easier to reach en route to reaching the others can often be the route to go. And for any new innovative product, the beachhead strategy, so who are your first customers, who are you first selling to, is absolutely pivotal. And one of the things I always emphasize, I would argue it's the most important point in trying to create impact in the space we are operating in, is to be clear on who's going to pay. So without a buyer, there is no impact. So understanding that and having that as a critical component when you develop a product and when you decide on the strategy ahead is pivotal. And back to that point on, often you'll unfortunately have to respect that en route to commoditization, i.e. to weed out the issues, to get early adopters that are willing to go in and take risk, to identify those customer groups that can pay a little bit more. That is the best way to ultimately accessing those who've got the least.
Thank you for the answer. And before we go to Bram, I would like to remind everybody who's joining this session that you have the opportunity to actually ask these panelists questions. So if you think, well, we didn't ask that one hard question that you really would like to put to our panelists, do put it in the chat and we will ask it for you. So Bram, maybe building further as well on Kristoffer, the person the party that pays for the product might not always be the same party that actually will use it. And you already mentioned the farmer. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how you engage with the local context?
Yeah, I think there's quite some interesting elements by the previous speakers here, and I fully agree. I think we need to stack local, regional, and global, and so they need to work together. And we need to know at which level do you engage. You're working with a farmer in a context in a certain space. in a certain social environment. But we do need to challenge ourselves to not just say, oh, so everything is context specific, so you cannot replicate, like was mentioned also by the previous speaker. On the contrary, if you have all those data points in diverse setups, then you can actually extract what is common and not driven by the circumstances per se or the environment per se, and so lift it up to a conceptual and methodological level that then can be applied regionally and globally. So you need the integration of global, regional, and local. And this is a bit similar to accepting that there's strategic, tactical, and operational innovations that we need to do. You need to do strategic innovations at a strategic level of decision making that can create an enabling environment that allows them to operate and scale some of those innovations. But I also want to highlight that indeed, in order to innovate, you need to be at the right point, right? If you don't have enough degrees of freedom to fail, if you're so close, if any failure in your crop means your family will have hunger, you're probably going to take the safe route. You're not ready to say, let me try something else unless it is really proven. So going to right above that, where the risk of gain is sufficiently high to take that risk, or where the gain is sufficiently high to take the risk of lose, that can be the starting point for an innovation. And then you have to generate a network around it. So I also don't believe by saying, well, let's just go to those, and then automatically it will go to the less fortunate or the more excluded. No, I think you need to be deliberate then about creating the knowledge network around those that can innovate. Now, if you have huge degrees of freedom and you're in a very, let's call, luxurious situation, probably the push to innovate is not there, right? You don't have the real drive. You have anyway dispensable energy, capital, and circumstance. So it's that right spot of setup to really generate the innovations. And then last but not least, and it's probably obvious for this audience, but still want to make the point, let's be very, very clear that science is not necessarily innovation, and innovation is not necessarily science. Thanks. Over to you, Christian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Bram. And I really like the definition of knowledge network that you just mentioned, and maybe we have a bit of time later on to further explore that. But before we go on to that, I would like to hand over to Thomas, who has a question from the audience.
Yeah, so there was a really interesting question from Edward in Oxford that asked, what does the Ukraine war teach us about the need for innovation in food security? So, obviously that's a question that's probably, more towards some than others on the panel. So let me slightly broaden the question for you, but I'd love to start with you, Bram. You're the obvious candidate for this one. But I think the broader question is, if you want to be sort of a purposeful innovator, how much do you respond to short-term crises versus you say, no, we actually need to work on the things that nobody's talking about, which is a societal issues 5, 10, 15 years ago. Louisa mentioned that, the biggest sensation 17 years in the making. So I'll start with you, Bram, but I'd love to hear other voices on that too.
Sure, and I think once again the response is going to be you need them both. If we look at the Ukraine-Russia crisis, let me tell a story. I've been working for a couple of months in designing scenarios that I wanted to take to decision makers. What was I talking about? Okay, let's make a scenario. What happens if climate change shuts down 2 of our biggest wheat producing areas, and what would be the ripple effect of that? And with the whole bunch of effort with scenario builders to show that. And I was going to go on a tour to decision makers, and then all of a sudden the Russia-Ukraine war hit, and I threw away all my scenarios because we are living it as we speak. What is happening right now in the food crisis, it is an effect and a ripple effect. And let's be very, very clear, it will never be simple again. This is a effect of a system where you get 2 countries that are wheat producing countries. 25% of the wheat traded globally comes from those 2 countries that are now shut down by this conflict. But they could have equally been shut down by a climate change, by a drought, by a flood, etc., etc. So we see it now live playing out. And so obviously there's a tendency to now immediately react to the short term, and we need to do that. but we need at the same time to look at the midterm and at the same time to look at the long term, because it is looking at the long term impacts, but it needs action now. All of those short, mid, and longer term need action that starts today. If we don't attend the underlying cause of our food system, we're going to be shock after shock after shock, and they're going to come faster at us than ever. Now, the good news is this is the first crisis in history where we have as much data and information as ever. This is also the first food crisis in history where we have so much innovation available that actually can be rapidly deployed. But I do think in order to take the right decisions in the short term, we need to backcast from a future view. The question to respond to this crisis is, what's the right thing to do? So in 2100, we have a better world. And if you ask that question, it becomes very, very concrete. If today the humanitarian sector can go out, for example, with seed for the next growing season, because that's where we are, right? We need to get crop into the field in areas where we probably were not being that productive because it was easier to buy it from Russia or Ukraine, but it's simply not available today. So if that humanitarian intervention is not for CIMMYT to step in the way, because there's others way better at that, World Food Program and others. But if we can show to the World Food Program and others that actually if you're gonna bring seed there, let it be drought-resistant seeds. Those drought-resistant seeds are available. So it's exactly the same action. Those seeds are exactly the same. The logistics is exactly the same. So you have a scenario A and a scenario B that for those that pay for it is exactly going to be the same. The action of those that are doing it is going to be exactly the same. But the future resilience we are building is going to be very, very difficult, very, very different. Because one type of seed is drought resistance and the other isn't. So it's these kind of plays together that we need to play out. By the way, if you're interested in our response agenda for the Ukraine-Russia crisis, which is actually not really the Ukraine-Russia crisis, it's for the shock against the food system, and where we are clearly advocating that we need to shift from an efficiency mindset to a resilience mindset, then please just look it up on the website.
Very, very good. I mean, I don't think we have to go for every question to every panelist, but Kristoffer, Louisa, would you like to add something to either the Ukraine, the narrow question, or the sort of this question, short-term versus long-term crisis?
I think Bram has covered that. I don't have the expertise to comment on the Ukraine situation, so I'll leave that to Bram.
Kristoffer, do you want to add something? Otherwise, I'll go straight back to Chris.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we constantly balance, right? So we are constantly shot from one emergency to the next as UNICEF, and at the same time trying to mitigate some of the underlying issues. I used to argue that the emergency is where you come up with the ideas or the needs that you solve for the next emergency, right? Because it takes quite a while. I've seen, I mean, of course, with the COVID vaccines as the best example, but also the oxygen example I gave before, things that, you know, people tend to say that we used to think that it took 10 years to develop a vaccine, right? Or 15. So it's pretty incredible. I think this crisis has taught us how quickly things can move if the right incentive is there and if the regulators sort of get involved in the right way to allow for things to move forward. And I do think, you know, it's a little bit maybe like we all know the example of the 100-meter run or whatever it is. Like once you break that barrier and you see what's possible, then all of a sudden like that. And I do think we maybe need to start seeing the opportunities, or fully embracing the opportunities that these kind of crises can yield. And this comes from someone who is somewhat skeptical on thinking that it could move that fast, but we have seen it now, right? And I think we need to take that to heart. Or in a way, I don't think we're going to get it any other way, because now we know it's possible as humanity, as a species, and that's going to allow it to happen. So I guess I believe and hope that there's a synergy between the two, that we can't not think of safe sanitation, right? So that's one of the big issues that's just always there, the open defecation issue, right? And we've got to innovate towards that on an ongoing basis, even though there's never really a crisis around it, but it's a thing we have to address. At the same time, these major crises allows for innovations to come and then open up our mindset to see what's actually possible once we align against a certain target.
Fantastic. Let me hand back to Chris.
Yeah, Thank you, Thomas. And I would like to slightly refer as well to one of the questions that we received from the audience from Mark, who's based in the US and calling in from North Carolina. So the question that is being asked is, so how do we build, and it sort of relates as well to what Bram earlier mentioned, how do we build these knowledge networks and how do we build these infrastructures in order to have sort of the local support in order to carry this kind of innovation? And I'll be actually quite curious. So before we maybe answer that too as well, hear from Louisa, because it's about empowerment and democratization and building sort of the user base and the understanding of how to use on one hand maybe the devices or the products or to apply it in the right way. So maybe Louisa, would you like to start and maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you roll out the device, because it's quite a novel way to sequencing, and it's sort of shaking up the entire way that we have done science so far. So how do you explain this to the scientists on the ground, and maybe you draw in as well those actors that would normally otherwise not have access and would not know how to use a sequencing device? Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think when thinking about genomics in general, I think it's important to think of this, of that long-term view as well. It's come up regularly throughout this conversation. I think we believe we're on the cusp of a genomic era. We've already heard it come up with examples that we've heard. There's DNA sequencing, the pandemic surveillance, being on the front page of the news over the last couple of years. Personalized medicine, the seed profiling we've heard from Bram, gene editing, DNA synthesis, DNA storage. So we see this transformation, in the same way that we think about what happened with computing. From massive mainframe computers, it's now a smartphone or a wearable device that we have much closer contact with. And if we see that happening with access and use of DNA and RNA information, right now we're pretty much still in the mainframe model. So we're thinking much further ahead to the point where genomic information and data is accessible and usable at a local level, at an individual level, if not regional or community level. And I think that trying to build for that takes time. The way that we've approached this is similarly to Kristoff's comment to one of my replies earlier, is around building early user groups. So building that knowledge base at a local level. Sometimes that might be across a region rather than just within a country. It's identifying those scientific evangelists who can see that future vision and can see the potential and are able to initiate and sustain local user groups with a common interest. It's certainly not possible for a company or a manufacturer to do that. Actually, for us, we want to sort of spark that flame and that fire burns with the excitement and enthusiasm and applicability of what technology can do at a local level. So identifying the evangelists in a local community, supporting them with training, both on the wet lab side, bioinformatics setup, automation if that's a requirement. And certainly that's where we prioritize our efforts, is how do we build those first users and then support the connectivity. We have regular community meetings that are free to attend online for attendees. We have thousands of our customers around the world join these events that happen twice a year, and that provides the latest technology updates, allows connection and introduction to those who have either similar projects that they're thinking about or similar problems to solve. So there are a couple of the ways that we're thinking about this, and will continue to evolve based upon how quickly these networks grow and what feedback we get from our customers locally.
I would like to learn a little bit more about that, because in comparison to maybe the type of innovations that Bram and Kristoffer talked about, for example, with a seed, it's quite obvious what you do with it. You put it in the ground and something will grow. The same thing with a ventilator. The application is quite clear. But when it comes to your device, I was wondering, of course, there's been sort of a broad idea about what you could do with it. But have you found as well that maybe locally people came up with uses that you would not have imagined yourself?
There are so many. So, one of the things that we intended to do was to develop a really broad user base. And we did that. And now you have the pleasure, of hearing stories from really interesting areas. We see things, such as water testing, right? Looking at quality of water at different stages of water treatment, for example. You can look at different bacterial or other pathogens that might be present or absent. You can look at environmental DNA, which is really important when we're thinking about biodiversity and changing environments over time, or with man-made intrusion, and thinking about impact on species. And looking at eDNA gives you like a profile of that local environment. There are a lot of interesting applications for microbiome or metagenomics work. You can think about that in the longer term as, how do we think about our oral health, right? Using a toothbrush to collect a sample. How do we think about our gut health? How do we think about that in a hospital setting versus just at home as a consumer thinking about our wellness? And there are people working on all of these problems. How do we identify what infection is causing someone, what pathogen's causing an infection, when nothing that of our standard tests can identify it, right? How do we identify the unknown? And I think sequencing provides a possibility to do that relatively simply. I could probably go on for the rest of the session on this. So I should pause there.
I love these examples. Thank you so much. And so we've been listening now to quite different perspectives and different approaches. We heard about innovative ideas regarding food security, humanitarian problems, scientific challenges. And as this is sort of as well a discussion around what will business look like in the next 25 years, I'll be very curious to hear from the panelists, and I would like to maybe start with Kristoffer on this one. What is going to be the idea that is going to change your field, or is going to make a mark in your field over the next 25 years? So maybe first we start with Kristoffer, then we go to Bram, and then we ask Louisa.
Thanks. So I'm gonna combine my perspectives from my two hats, right? So I've got my UNICEF hat, which is about buying products and giving them away, if you will, to people that need them the most, and then my impact venture capital hat, where I'm investing in companies in various settings. I think the space that I believe will revolutionize the most, not the least in low resource settings, is allowing for beneficiaries, communities, to identify their own needs, if you will, and cut out the professional middleman. So specifically, I believe a lot in some of the censoring technology, making that ubiquitous, and what that can do in terms of giving agency, empowerment to people in requesting the kinds of health support they can get. I think the same is going to, I hope that the same will happen within education, where if you've been in the schools in these environments, you know the type of learning that happens there, which is not the best. And if people to a higher and higher degree can start requesting, demanding the learning that's possible by being able to access it outside of the school, I think we'll see things moving. This has issues with it. It can lead to further inequities in terms of those that don't have the skills to require this, to make use of these technologies. But I do think that for a large group of people, this is an opportunity for them to be more aware of what's possible, and the agency that has the potential to give them, allow them to demand, to request the types of services that can help them progress.
Thank you, Kristoffer. Over to you, Bram.
I really think that one of the biggest challenges that we have is really to shift our food system and all that implies, from that resilience, efficiency to the resilience piece, and that's going to require a completely different way of thinking. Now, luckily, those in the food system that produce our food are really used to thinking about resilience, and resilient doesn't mean that you're completely inefficient. It means that there is a combination that you can stand back up, right? That there is this elasticity in the system, and I really think that things are going to change by using data-driven visualization tools, so we can actually make scenarios that are underpinned by information that is crowdsourced and can continually be updated. So I think this whole notion of getting faster and faster feedback loops with different types of data, so we can drive our system from efficiency to resilience on the one end. On the other end, I think the biggest innovation we also need to do is, what are those spaces that we miss? And let me give a very concrete example. I come from the, call it, research for development space. There's another space which is more the humanitarian space for immediate crisis response. And then you have the science space, right? Which is Oxford and others. We really need that interface where we can come together safely, so that we don't disturb a humanitarian crisis response, but still can apply science in a safe element there, maybe connect to that. So be that a call to keep the conversation going. Can we also innovate in how do we create safe spaces between different efforts and different sectors? For example, the health sector and agriculture. How do we bring some of that thinking better together? Thanks, Christian. Over to you.
Thanks, Bram. Louisa, the last remark for you.
Sure. I think, a lot of the comments that have been said, I agree with. I think this is about moving towards increasing, resilience by leveraging additional data and the value of that data to help us solve some of our biggest problems better, and to gain insights that allow us to do that in an evidence-based way. I think the features, that most excite me about the technology that we offer is that ability to stream genomic data or information in real time from the device as it's running. And that really lends itself well to thinking about how we use biological information. Of course, how we control it and how we regulate it is really important. That's probably another topic for panel discussion. But then that ability to have immediate access and sensing of our environment and how we interact with it. And I think there are a lot of interesting ways we might see that form part of our day-to-day, and to a point where over the next 25 years, we may forget that that's actually what we're seeing the way that we do now with our wearables and the data that we have to our immediate disposal, every day, every minute of every day. So I'm really interested to see where the first applications of that will come, whether that will be more in a personal consumer genomics space, or whether this will be at a government level looking to help with infrastructure to truly deliver personalised medicine and personalised healthcare within a healthcare setting. So I think there are lots of interesting things that nature of real-time connectivity of data and integration with the other things that we're measuring in our environments and in our worlds right now. That will be really interesting.
Thank you, Louisa. And just like that, we have already come to the end of the hour, and time flies when you're having fun, and we have been hearing very rich perspectives from an incredibly experienced panel. So we heard about purposeful innovation from the perspective of food security, humanitarian problems, and scientific challenges, and it gave a very nice overview from different angles how to think about purposeful innovation. And we are hugely grateful for the panel to take time and to be here today to share their experience, their thoughts, their reflections, and to speak from their own perspective regarding this topic. But before we give the big thank you, I would like to thank the audience for tuning in. I've been watching the chat, and I've seen people from all over the globe, from the US, from Kenya, from London, from Brazil, from Zimbabwe, from Nigeria, from China. Thank you all for being here. It is a community why we host these sessions. So I hope you learned something today. So tell your friends and your colleagues to join in next time, because as Louisa said, this is a conversation that is not quite finished yet, and we'll be back for more. Thomas, is there anything I'm forgetting at this point? Anything?
Maybe I'll just say a couple of things. I think when we're having a session like that, it's incredibly rich. And it's worth pointing out that there's some really important lessons, I think, for everybody. And partly it's what we didn't hear. We didn't hear that you have to be a particular organization, a startup, or a large company. The organizations we have with us are really diverse, yet they're all doing purposeful innovation. We didn't hear that, it's sort of innovation is about picking the next inspiration or picking the next technology. It's hard work. and it's work that takes years and years. And I think that's a really powerful message. And I think what we heard is innovation isn't a solo act. This is each one of you is organizing communities, influencing, bringing ecosystems together. And I think these are really powerful messages. So I've learned a lot from our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And this is normally where you would get the big applause, and it's always a bit awkward online, but this is where you would get it. Thank you so much for joining us today, and it's absolutely wonderful having you.